The number you have dialed has been changed. The new number is...
Communication, the exchange of information or news between people or places. No means of communication has revolutionized the daily lives of ordinary people more than the telephone. Telephone is a combination of two Greek words, tele meaning afar, and phone meaning voice or sound. From the beginning of time, man resorted to grunting and shouting in order to communicate, but they needed new ways to make their voices be heard. Early cavemen used fire signals. Romans used doves to send messages. During the Revolutionary Age, many people sent letters to the postal office via Pony Express. Following letters were telegrams. Flashing messages through Morse code was invented as well. All of these ways, however, had many complications. The telephone has largely reformed communication as it has been revolutionized through history.
In 1834, huge steps were taken towards the telephone. The telegraph was the first step to making electrical signals travel from one device to another. There were multiple inventors who assisted in the making of the telegraph, but mainly one man was responsible for putting it all together. And that man was Samuel Finley Breese Morse. The word telegraph is derived from Greek and means to write far.
People talked a lot about the telegraph as the annihilator of space and time. I think what the cable anticipates is the idea of the wiring of the world, creating a neighborhood of the whole world.
Technology involved with the telegraph used a worldwide wire system that included stations, operators, and messengers, which carried messages and news by electricity faster than any invention that came before it. In 1844, Samuel F.B. Morse demonstrated the Baltimore, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. telegraph line that would be the first to carry the signals of Morse code, an abstraction of the written word. It was a system of lines and dashes, or dits and dots. By knowing the code, people could have conversations and send messages. This reformed many ways of communicating, such as in war. One of the most famous codes became SOS. The Morse code was one of the biggest contributors towards the telephone.
In 1854, M. Charles Bourzel, a French telegraphist, had developed a plan for transmitting sounds as well as through electric currents. Then in 1860, Philip Rice developed a telephone. Rice's phone was the first innovation to transmit the spoken word. It aroused interest in the United States in 1872 when it was demonstrated in New York, but also displayed that the sound was hard to transmit and the speech was muffled. Bourzel deserves recognition for the thought of the telephone, but Rice deserves credit for effectuating it. However, they both had many shortcomings and errors.
The 1860s and 70s provided the most progression for the telephone. In 1866, the second transatlantic cable was installed because the Washington, D.C. and Baltimore cable that Morse proposed failed after 26 days. Now that a good mean of transmission of the signals was available, greater advancements towards the telephone could be made. In 1874, Alexander Graham Bell invented the chief principle of the telephone. One could lease a telephone for the expensive price of $20 to $40 per year, but only the wealthy were able to participate in the new craze. In 1876, Alexander Graham Bell was issued a patent for improvements in telegraphy. Elisha Gray applied for a similar patent just hours after Bell. Gray and Bell fought for years in court as to whose telephone was legal.
In 1877, Thomas Edison received a patent in Britain for the electromotograph. Edison's carbon-based transmitter is still used in telephones today. Edison then devised a telephone receiver employing this principle in which the different electrical signals created a moving surface. It was commonly called the loud phone because it was so ear-piercing. In the same year, the first permanent outdoor telephone wires were strung and commercial telephone service began in the United States. As a reaction, the telephone provided jobs for many people. Women worked in stations and sat at the switchboards for endless hours transferring telephone exchanges and calls. In 1891, the first automatic dial system was patented by a Kansas City funeral director, so switchboard operators were no longer necessary to make the telephone call. Many people lost jobs at this time, but more work was ahead for the telephone.
A pioneer is someone who does it for the first time, someone who goes into an area and provides something on the basis of faith and hope and vision and whatever it may be, and says, you know, if we were to bring this to this place, if we were to make this available, if we were to somehow do something that's never been done before, it could have quite an impact.
Cell phones did not come about until 1894 when Oliver Lodge demonstrated wireless communication over a distance of 150 yards. This was the commencement of telephone technology. In 1890, the cable telephone was improved even further with the development of the coin telephone in Hartford, Connecticut. Western Union was the main telegraph company up until the 1910s. In 1911, American Telephone and Telegraph, or AT&T, took over Western Union Telegraph Company and would be the largest telephone company until the 1980s. 4 years later, in 1915, the Bell system completed a U.S. transcontinental telephone line. This was huge. It meant that everyone in the U.S. was connected to each other. This drastically impacted the communication industry and displayed how the telephone was a major revolution.
Companies had better means of communicating as well as emergency services and much more. The United States was in a boom. After this major connection in 1918, 10 million Bell system telephones were in use. Many inventions occurred as a reaction to the telephone, such as teletypewriter services, fax machines, enabling the deaf to use the telephone, and moving vehicles' radios connected to the telephone network. 4 years later, in 1950, people became charged per minute for telephone use so that companies could make a profit.
Modern video calling technologies such as Skype or Uvu evolved from the first video phone in the 1960s. People could see who they were talking to. This, however, was not as popular as normal telephone calling because of the expense. However, as modern technology reduced the price of video telephony, it still was not used often. Following the video phone, the original telephone was yet modified again and with buttons to dial numbers instead of dials.
The communication industry faced another advancement in 1966 when Casey Keough and G.A. Hockham published their Principles of Fiber Optic Communications. This enabled telephone calls to carry thousands of calls. So what exactly transformed telephones from being bulky and heavy to the small PCs that we have today? The Intel Corporation single-chip microprocessor, the 4004, created in 1971, made telephones and switching systems smaller, lighter, and faster to use. A year after the microprocessor was invented, Motorola demonstrated their first cellular phone, known as the bag phone. People were amazed that they could call each other without wires.
The IBM PC that was introduced in 1981 made many modern features of phones such as web access possible today. The internet used the telephone lines in the future to transmit information through a personal computer. In 1982, AT&T, known as Ma Bell, agreed to split into other telephone companies called Baby Bells. Motorola then produced their first pocket phone in 1989.
The invention had many positive reactions. The telephone impacted many other devices, such as telecommunication products. These included the television, video chatting, video games, and computers. It affected more than just the communication industry. It affected the business industry, because it created multiple business opportunities that could go worldwide and communicate over long distances. Before the telephone was invented, people had to find out news from newspapers and people that traveled, which wasn't helpful because they had to rely on memory. Today, businesses hold meetings via video chatting and telephone. Other industries that were affected was the medical industry. It made 911 hotlines available for people in case of emergencies. Calls can be made 24 hours a day and 7 days a week. Information traveled faster because of the telephone, and less money was spent by businesses on postal services. Multiple industries were affected by the telephone as it modernized our world today.
Many companies jumped on the idea of the telephone. Multiple providers came about such as AT&T, Verizon Wireless, T-Mobile, Sprint, Motorola, and many others. Other small companies formed to keep up with the growing telephone industry. These provided many jobs for people and boosted the economy. All of these companies have constantly reformed their phones to compete with the rival companies. All companies aspire to have the newest, fastest, best phone. The speed of communication sped up the rate of scientific and technological change as well as economic growth.
Although the telephone provided all of these influential and significant benefits, it also created disadvantages. Due to the development of the telephone, people stopped communicating face-to-face. Pressures were created in having the newest and latest phone, and people have become obsessed with buying the best in telephone technology. Both a pro and a con is the fact that many young kids today own a cell phone. It helps the younger generations become more technologically advanced, but some become addicted to things such as texting, which has led to cyberbullying. Cell phones have resulted in countless car accidents, leaving many innocent people either injured or killed. Laws are being set in place about the use of cell phones while driving. This has led to an upcoming industry of driving while talking, and texting devices, such as cars, are being made with built-in phones. The telephone industry seems to be never-ending and open to anything. As a result of the telephone and its effects on today's society, the world has learned to cope with this unfading industry and its infinite reforms. Without the evolution of the telephone, its reforms, and its reaction on society, life as we know it may cease to exist.
Hello, hello, baby, you called, I can't hear a thing. I have got no service in the club, you say. What did you say? Oh, you're breaking up on me.